There is a particular kind of power that only survives in darkness, not the power of armies or parliaments, not the power of speeches or elections or the kind of authority that announces itself with motorcades and flags and the thud of ceremonial drums. The kind of power we're talking about is quieter and far more dangerous than any of that. It is the kind of power that is never named in official documents, never photographed at ribbon cuttings, never quoted by name in state media. It moves instead through back channels and encrypted messages and the quiet reassignment of loyalties. It operates through the selective advancement of careers and the equally selective destruction of them. It expresses itself not in proclamations but in outcomes, in elections that go a certain way, in protests that get suppressed with a particular speed and ferocity, in intelligence files that appear and disappear at precisely the right moments. The kind of power, in other words, that when the lights are finally turned on, has already been there for 20 years. For most of his adult life, Mojtaba Khamenei was that kind of power. Most Iranians, 90 million of them, had never heard his voice in public. They knew his face from occasional photographs, a bearded figure in clerical robes standing slightly behind the men who made the headlines, a shape in the background, a rumor confirmed by proximity. They knew his name the way you know the name of a storm that hasn't yet made landfall, with a vague, unspecific dread, a sense that something is coming that no one is quite ready to name. Western intelligence agencies had fragments, Iranian opposition groups had whispers, investigative journalists who tried to write about him found their sources going silent mid-story. The few public references to his role in Iranian affairs were either vague enough to be deniable or specific enough to be dangerous to the person who made them. He was the most consequential man in the country that most people in the country had never had a real conversation about. Then, in the first week of March 2026, the storm arrived. His father, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the man who had ruled one of the most complex, defiant, nuclear-adjacent nations on Earth for 37 years, was killed in a joint American and Israeli airstrike on Tehran. The man who had survived internal purges, external assassination attempts, and 3.5 decades of international sanctions designed to bring his country to its knees was killed. In the end, by precision weapons guided by satellite intelligence in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. And when the smoke cleared, the man who had spent decades learning to be invisible stepped into the most visible position in the Islamic world. This is the story of Mojtaba Khamenei. It is a story about power and inheritance, about theology weaponized and money hidden, about a man who may have engineered his own ascension while publicly denying he wanted it, about what it means when a nation built on rejecting dynastic monarchy installs, under the literal fire of war, the son of the man it called the father of the revolution. It is a story about Iran, its contradictions, its ambitions, its extraordinary capacity for survival, and about a figure who understood those contradictions better than anyone alive and used them, methodically, across the span of his entire adult life to position himself at the center of them. And it is a story about what comes next. For Iran, for the Middle East, for the global economy, and for a world now holding its breath over a nuclear program that just lost the one man who had a theological argument for restraint. To understand Mojtaba Khamenei, you have to understand what kind of country he was born into, and what kind of country it was in the process of becoming. In the summer of 1969, the Islamic Republic of Iran did not yet exist. The country that Mojtaba Khamenei entered on September 8th of that year was officially known as the Imperial State of Iran, and it was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the light of the Aryans, the shadow of God, a monarch backed by Washington and Tel Aviv, flanked by a secret police apparatus called SAVAK that was trained by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad and was notorious for its expertise in torture and sitting atop the fourth largest oil reserves on Earth. The Iran of 1969 was modernizing on the surface: highways, universities, a growing middle class, state television broadcasting Western programming into Iranian homes, while simultaneously suppressing, with considerable violence, any political movement that challenged the Shah's absolute authority. His father, Sayyid Ali Hosseini Khamenei, was at that moment a 30-year-old mid-ranking cleric in the northeastern city of Mashhad, a city built around the shrine of Imam Reza, the 8th Imam of Twelver Shia Islam, and one of the holiest sites in the Shia world. Ali was not yet famous. He was not yet a national figure of any kind. He had been arrested and briefly imprisoned by the Shah's regime for his religious political activities, an experience that deepened his convictions rather than moderating them. But he had not yet been exiled, had not yet met Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the volcanic revolutionary scholar who was at that moment living in exile in Najaf, Iraq, transmitting cassette tapes of his sermons back into Iran and slowly, patiently building the ideological architecture of what would become the world's first modern theocracy. Mojtaba was 9 years old when everything changed. The 1979 Iranian Revolution was one of the most seismic political events of the 20th century. It was not simply a change of government, it was the replacement of an entire cosmology. The Shah's vision of Iran as a secular, Western-aligned, oil-exporting monarchy, with a completely different one, the Velayat-e-Faqih, or guardianship of the Islamic jurist, the doctrine that Khomeini had developed in exile, and that held that in the absence of the hidden imam, supreme political and religious authority should rest with the most qualified Islamic scholar. The revolution swept away not just the Shah and Savak and the court and the aristocracy, but the entire framework of Iranian political life. It replaced it with something genuinely unprecedented in the modern world. For the boy Mojtaba, this was not a historical event absorbed through textbooks. It was lived experience. He watched his father transform in real time from a mid-ranking persecuted cleric into one of the central figures of a revolution that was remaking an ancient country from its foundations. He watched Ali Khamenei become a close associate of Khomeini himself. He watched him survive an assassination attempt in 1981, a bomb hidden in a tape recorder that exploded during a press conference and permanently paralyzed his right arm. He watched him serve as president of the Islamic Republic for 2 terms, from 1981 to 1989, before being elevated, upon Khomeini's death, to the position of supreme leader, the second holder of that office in the Republic's history, and the man who would hold it for the next 37 years. That proximity to supreme authority is where the real education began. Though seminary was coming, but in the lived observation of how a theocratic state actually functions, how decisions are made and unmade, who the power brokers are and what they want, how loyalty is manufactured and maintained, how enemies are identified, neutralized, and occasionally rehabilitated. Mojtaba Khamenei did not grow up as a civilian watching the Islamic Republic from the outside. He grew up inside its operating system, watching his father work the levers. He attended schools in Sardasht and Mahabad before completing his secondary education in Tehran. He was a serious student. Observers who knew him in those years describe a young man of notable discipline and unusual self-containment, someone who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything he heard. After high school, he entered the theological seminary system, not immediately in Qom, but beginning under the guidance of his father, and later under Ayatollah Mahmoud Hashemi Sharudi, a respected jurist who would go on to become the head of Iran's judiciary. But before the full arc of his clerical education could take shape, the Iran-Iraq War intervened. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in September 1980, launched with quiet encouragement from Washington, which was still furious about the hostage crisis, and with weapons supplied by a coalition of Western and Arab governments, became the defining national trauma of the Islamic Republic's early years. By the time Mojtaba was 17, the war had already consumed hundreds of thousands of Iranian lives. The front lines ran through the oil-rich Khuzestan province in the west. Iranian boys his age were dying in human wave assaults across minefields that the Islamic Republic's commanders ordered with a theological conviction that martyrdom was not a tragedy but a privilege. Mojtaba joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Pasdaran, the IRGC, and was assigned to the Habib Battalion, serving in the war's closing years. The Iran-Iraq War ended in August 1988 with a United Nations brokered ceasefire that Khomeini famously described as being like drinking a cup of poison. It had killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, depending on whose count you trust, and had left an entire generation of Iranian men scarred by experiences that civilian life was not equipped to process. What it left Mojtaba with was something more valuable than rank or decoration. It left him with a network. The officers he served alongside in the Habib Battalion were not abstract colleagues. They were men he had eaten with in trenches, men he had watched make life-and-death decisions under artillery fire, men whose characters he had assessed in the most extreme circumstances human beings can face. These were men who would go on, over the next 2 decades, to command Iran's intelligence services, its internal security apparatus, its covert operations networks, its domestic surveillance programs. And they would remember, through all of that Mojtaba Khamenei had been there at the beginning, not as a general, not as a politician, but as one of them. After the war, he returned to his theological studies, this time in Qom, the holy city that is to Shia Islam, what the Vatican is to Roman Catholicism, a dense network of seminaries and scholars and rival theological schools clustered around the great shrine of Fatima Masumeh. In Qom, he completed the coursework and examinations required to be recognized as a Hujjatul Islam, a mid-ranking clerical title that translates roughly as Proof of Islam. One level below an Ayatollah, he married Zahra Haddad Adel, daughter of Gholam Ali Haddad Adel, a conservative political figure who would later serve as Speaker of Parliament and who was among the closest civilian advisors to the Supreme Leader. The marriage was, by every account, also a political alliance, a deliberate weaving together of 2 powerful conservative threads in the Islamic Republic's fabric. And then he did something that, given his pedigree and his connections, was genuinely unusual. He essentially disappeared from public life. Not literally, of course, but for the son of the supreme leader of Iran, for a man with IRGC connections going back to the war, with theological credentials from Qom, with a marriage into one of the Republic's most powerful conservative families. Mojtaba Khamenei became astonishingly invisible. He held no formal government title. He gave no public lectures and delivered no Friday sermons, unlike virtually every other politically ambitious cleric in the system. He did not appear on state television. He did not write policy papers, did not cultivate a public persona, did not issue statements or hold press conferences. He did not, as far as anyone could document, do any of the things that ambitious men in systems of power traditionally do to build a public profile. He became a rumor, a shadow, a name passed in whispers at the margins of conversations about things that mattered. Western intelligence analysts trying to build a profile of him found almost nothing usable. The Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, MI6, all maintained files on the major figures of the Islamic Republic, files that grew thick with photographs and transcripts and financial intelligence and travel records. The file on Mojtaba Khamenei was thin. Iranian journalists who began nosing around his activities found their sources going suddenly quiet, their phone calls going unanswered, 1 or 2 of them receiving the kind of indirect warning that doesn't need to be explicit to be clearly understood. Diaspora opposition figures and activists who tried to document his role in the system spoke his name in carefully coded language, not because they didn't know, but because saying it too directly carried costs. And yet the decisions he was allegedly making were enormous. The power he was allegedly wielding was not ministerial or administrative. It was structural, systemic, the kind that doesn't show up in org charts but that shapes which names appear on org charts. The power to influence who gets appointed to what, who gets investigated for what, which election outcomes get certified and which get queried. The invisible power of a man who understands, at a deep level, how a system actually works, rather than how it officially describes itself. The ghost in the machine had been running the machine for years before anyone could prove it. To understand Mojtaba's ideology, the belief system that now sits at the apex of a nation of 90 million people with an active nuclear program and ballistic missiles capable of reaching most of Europe, you have to look carefully at who he chose to learn from. Because in the world of Qom, the choice of mentor is not a casual academic decision. It is a manifesto. It is a declaration of what you believe, what you are willing to do with power, and what kind of future you intend to build. His primary mentor was Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi Mesbah Yazdi, and the choice of Mesbah Yazdi tells you almost everything you need to know about Mojtaba Khamenei's worldview. In Iran's extraordinarily complex theological landscape, a landscape that encompasses everything from quietist clerics who believe religious scholars should stay entirely out of politics, to moderate reformists who believe the Islamic Republic can democratize from within, to hardline conservatives who believe any political compromise with Western values is an act of apostasy. Mesbah Yazdi occupied an extreme corner. He was not merely conservative. He was, in the carefully chosen words of the Atlantic Council, among the most ideologically extremist clerics in the Islamic Republic's history. His critics, including many senior Iranian clerics who would consider themselves hardliners by any normal standard, nicknamed him Professor Crocodile for what they described as his cold-blooded willingness to justify virtually any exercise of state violence in the name of divine will. Mesbah Yazdi's core theological positions were straightforward and radical. Democratic legitimacy, in his framework, was not just secondary to divine authority, it was positively dangerous, a Western import designed to undermine the Islamic State. The people's will, he argued, was irrelevant in a system where God's will had been expressed through the office of the supreme leader. Elections could be useful tools for conferring legitimacy, but their outcomes could not be allowed to threaten the fundamental architecture of theocratic governance. And violence, the suppression of dissent, the imprisonment and torture of opponents, the killing of those who threatened the Islamic order, was not merely politically defensible. It was, in specific circumstances, a religious obligation. This was not a fringe position muttered in private. This was a publicly argued theological stance, taught in seminaries, published in books, and transmitted to generations of students. Mojtaba Khamenei sat at this man's feet. He absorbed this curriculum not as a student memorizing positions for an exam, but as a future practitioner who understood, at some level, that what he was learning was not just theology, but a complete operating manual for a particular kind of state. A state in which the supreme leader's authority was absolute, in which dissent was heresy rather than politics, in which the security apparatus existed not to protect citizens but to protect the order, and in which any means necessary to preserve that order were, by definition, legitimate. It also cemented his standing with the IRGC's most ideologically committed wing. The Revolutionary Guard was never a monolithic institution. It contained pragmatists and ideologues, careerists and true believers. But its hardline faction, the officers who ran the intelligence directorate, who oversaw the Basij, who managed Iran's covert operations in Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, these men spoke the same theological language that Mesbah Yazdi taught. When they looked at Mojtaba, they saw not just the supreme leader's son, but a man who shared their worldview at the level of first principles. He was not an outsider who needed to be managed. He was one of them. His marriage to Zahra Haddad Adel completed the circuit. Gholam Ali Haddad Adel, his father-in-law, was not merely a conservative politician. He was the only non-cleric considered part of Khamenei's innermost circle, a man described by analysts as one of the supreme leader's most trusted confidants on domestic and cultural policy. Through this marriage, Mojtaba was not just inheriting his father's theological authority, he was embedding himself in the civilian conservative establishment at its highest levels, becoming, through the grammar of family alliance, a node through which multiple networks of power were connected. Iran specialist Afshon Ostovar, speaking to NPR in the final days before Mojtaba's appointment was announced, suggested that his selection represented an effort to preserve the system's status quo. But analysts who had studied him more closely reached a different conclusion. A status quo figure is someone who wants to keep things roughly as they are. Mojtaba Khamenei, in the assessment of multiple serious analysts, is something closer to an accelerationist, a man whose ideology is not conservative in the sense of cautious, but revolutionary in the sense of impatient with the limitations of what has already been achieved. The Islamic Republic under his father had been, in its later years, a system of managed tensions, between the hardliners and the pragmatists, between the security state and a civil society that refused to disappear, between nuclear ambition and the economic damage of sanctions. Mojtaba Khamenei has spent his adult life on one side of every one of those tensions, and he is now in a position to tip them. If you want to understand what Mojtaba Khamenei is capable of when his power is threatened, look at the summer of 2009. Because 2009 was not just a crisis for the Islamic Republic. According to a growing body of evidence, it was Mojtaba's audition. Iran had just completed a presidential election. The incumbent, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the populist, anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying former mayor of Tehran, who had won the presidency in 2005 with what many believed was substantial interference from the IRGC, was declared the winner over 3 challengers, most notably the reformist Mir Hossein Mousavi, a former prime minister whose campaign had generated a genuine wave of popular enthusiasm. The results were announced with a speed that made serious analysts around the world wince. Tens of millions of votes counted in a matter of hours, results showing Ahmadinejad winning in regions where he was known to have little support. Statistical anomalies of a kind that don't happen in legitimate elections. Mousavi and his running mate Mehdi Karoubi immediately declared the result fraudulent and called their supporters into the streets. What came next was the largest popular uprising in Iran since the revolution itself. Millions of Iranians, many of them wearing or carrying green, the campaign colour that gave the movement its name, flooded the streets of Tehran and dozens of other cities. Their slogan was, "Where is my vote?" But the underlying demand was larger than that. It was a demand for a republic that functioned as one, for elections that were not determined in advance, for a political system in which their participation meant something. They were extraordinary. They were, for a brief and incandescent moment, some of the most moving public demonstrations of democratic aspiration that the world had seen in years. The response was ferocious. The Basij resistance force, the volunteer paramilitary militia that served as the regime's most direct instrument of domestic control, whose members were recruited primarily from the rural poor and the most ideologically committed segment of the urban working class, and who had been trained to treat internal dissent as an existential threat to the Islamic order, was mobilized across the country. Basij members on motorcycles, armed with batons and in some cases firearms, drove into crowds of protesters. Security forces in unmarked vehicles detained hundreds. The Evin prison, already notorious as the site of decades of political imprisonment and torture, began receiving waves of new inmates. An unknown number of detainees, human rights organizations documented dozens of cases, were sexually assaulted in custody. The journalist, Maziar Bahari, was imprisoned for more than 100 days. The philosopher Abdolkarim Soroush fled the country. Dozens of student activists were handed sentences of years in prison for the crime of marching in public. And on June 20th, 2009, a 26-year-old woman named Neda Agha Sultan was shot in the chest while standing near a protest in Tehran. A bystander captured her death on a mobile phone. The video spread across the world within hours. She became the face, literally the face, her eyes open and her expression one of ordinary human surprise of what it cost to ask for an accountable government in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The official account of the 2009 crackdown holds that it was ordered by the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who publicly declared Ahmadinejad's victory legitimate and instructed security forces to restore order. This is the account that most Western coverage of those events has accepted and repeated. But in 2023, Iran International, the London-based Persian-language news outlet that has broken a series of significant stories about internal IRGC documents, published what it described as leaked internal records that complicated this picture considerably. Those documents, if authentic, indicated that by 2009, Mojtaba Khamenei had accumulated sufficient informal authority within the IRGC's political structure that he effectively controlled the Basij. Not formally, not through any official title, but through the network of relationships he had been building since his service in the Iran-Iraq War and deepening throughout the subsequent 2 decades. The document suggested he wielded significant influence over appointments and dismissals within both the intelligence organization and the Intelligence Protection Organization, the 2 bodies most directly responsible for the surveillance, arrest, and interrogation of political opponents. What this means, if the documents accurately reflect the operational reality of 2009, is that the crackdown on the Green Movement may have been as much Mojtaba's operation as his father's, that the street-level terror, the motorcycles and the batons and the Evin prison cells, was not simply the supreme leader's will expressed through the security apparatus, but was actively organized and directed by his son through networks that his son had spent 20 years constructing precisely for moments like this. This would explain something that Iranian observers had found puzzling since the beginning. The protesters in 2009 were not merely chanting against Ahmadinejad, or against the election result, or even against the supreme leader in the abstract. Among the most commonly heard chants in those summer streets, documented in countless videos, heard by every journalist present, was this specific formulation: "Wish you death, Mojtaba, so you would never be the next leader." Let that sink in. Iranian street protesters, people with no access to CIA files or IRGC internal documents or think tank analyses, had, through some combination of street intelligence and instinctive political literacy, arrived at precisely the conclusion that Western analysts would spend years slowly and cautiously approaching. They knew that the man responsible for what was being done to them was not only the supreme leader but his son. They knew that the son was positioning himself for succession, and they were begging, in the streets, at personal risk, chanting into the face of the Basij, for that succession to be stopped. It wasn't stopped. Former presidential candidate and opposition leader Mehdi Karoubi wrote a series of letters to the supreme leader in the aftermath of 2009 that were extraordinary for their specificity. In them, he referred repeatedly to a figure he called the Master, a figure widely understood by everyone who read the letters to be Mojtaba, whom he accused of having rigged the 2005 presidential election that first brought Ahmadinejad to power and then doing it again in 2009. These accusations were never formally investigated. Karoubi was eventually placed under house arrest, where he has remained for years. The United States Treasury Department, in its 2019 sanctions designation of Mojtaba Khamenei, offered its own official assessment. The designation stated that Mojtaba worked closely with the IRGC commander and the Basij to advance his father's destabilizing regional ambitions and oppressive domestic objectives. It described him as a key node in the network through which Supreme Leader authority was translated into IRGC operational reality. It was, in the language of international sanctions, a formal acknowledgement that the man without a title was doing the work of several men with titles. But here is what the mainstream coverage of 2009 has consistently missed. The investment Mojtaba made in that crackdown was not primarily about loyalty to his father. It was not even primarily about suppressing a threat to the Islamic Republic's political system, though it was certainly that. It was a generational investment in his own future. Every IRGC commander who understood that Mojtaba had been the operational architect of 2009 owed him something. Every Basij officer whose career had been advanced through the networks Mojtaba controlled owed him something. Every political figure who had benefited from the election outcomes that Mojtaba had helped engineer owed him something. He was not building loyalty in the abstract. He was building a specific, concrete, thoroughly documented bank of political debt. The kind of debt that, when the moment came, could be collected in the currency of Assembly of Experts votes. In March 2026, the moment came. The debt was collected. The Islamic Republic of Iran was founded, in significant part, as a moral argument. The argument was this: the Pahlavi dynasty had betrayed Iran not merely politically, but spiritually. The Shah and his family had lived in a manner that insulted the dignity of ordinary Iranians and mocked the Islamic values that most of the country held. They had thrown parties of extraordinary opulence. The 1971 celebration at Persepolis marking 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy is the most famous example. A spectacle that cost an estimated $200 million, while millions of Iranians lived in poverty, acquired vast properties across Europe and America, built a personal fortune estimated in the billions from oil wealth that belonged to the nation, and presided over an inequality so stark that it had become one of the primary engines of revolutionary anger. The revolution was not simply a demand for political freedom, it was a demand for decency, for leaders who understood themselves as servants rather than proprietors. This moral argument was not rhetorical decoration. It was the foundation of the regime's legitimacy. Khomeini had lived, by all accounts, with genuine austerity. A simple house, plain food, the lifestyle of a scholar rather than a potentate. Ali Khamenei maintained, throughout his decades in power, a public image of similar simplicity. The supreme leaders of the Islamic Republic were, officially and emphatically, different from the Shah. Shareholders of nothing. What Bloomberg found in the course of a year-long investigation published in January 2026, just weeks before the war that would kill Ali Khamenei and elevate his son, did not merely complicate this image. It demolished it. The investigation revealed that Mojtaba Khamenei, the man who held no official government title, who had no publicly known source of income, who presented himself to the Iranian public and to the wider world as a humble student of Islamic law and theology, had over the course of 2 decades accumulated a property empire of remarkable scope and ambition. In London, he owned luxury residential properties on the Bishop's Avenue in Hampstead, a street so thoroughly colonised by the global ultra-wealthy that London tabloids call it Billionaires' Row, a stretch of neo-Georgian and mock-Tudor mansions that has housed Saudi princes, Russian oligarchs, and Nigerian oil magnates. A street where the asking prices for individual properties routinely exceed £20 million. In Dubai, the city that has become, over the past 2 decades, the preferred offshore financial hub for the sanctioned and the secretive, the place where money that cannot be kept at home goes to wait. He held a villa in Emirates Hills, the gated residential enclave that Dubai's real estate agents describe, with characteristic restraint as the Beverly Hills of the Middle East. Properties in Emirates Hills change hands for tens of millions of dollars. The compound is home to Emirati royalty, to the senior executives of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, to businessmen whose fortunes are documented, and to businessmen whose fortunes very much are not, across Europe, in Frankfurt, in Mallorca, in locations the Bloomberg investigation identified but did not always name in full. His holdings included high-end commercial properties and luxury hotels. The aggregate value of the portfolio, according to the investigation's analysis, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. This was not a collection of modest investments made by a man of modest means. This was a deliberate, sophisticated, multi-jurisdictional accumulation of trophy assets, the kind of portfolio that requires professional management, legal expertise across multiple regulatory environments, and a continuous flow of capital that is, by definition, unexplainable through any legitimate income source. The key to understanding how this was achieved without discovery for so long lies in the word that appears throughout the Bloomberg investigation: intermediaries. Almost none of the properties were in Mojtaba Khamenei's name. They were held instead through a labyrinthine network of shell companies, offshore vehicles, and business associates, the standard architecture of financial concealment in a world where beneficial ownership disclosure is inconsistent and cross-border enforcement is limited. One of the key figures identified in the investigation was a businessman named Ali Ansari, whose Bank Ayande had been forcibly dissolved by the Iranian state after it went bankrupt, having extended massive loans to unnamed parties who did not repay them. The identities of those unnamed parties are, in light of the Bloomberg investigation, considerably less unknown than they once appeared. Then, in January 2026, the story acquired an additional dimension that stripped away whatever remaining ambiguity existed. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in a public statement that appeared timed to coincide with a new round of sanctions pressure, announced that Iran's senior leadership had been engaged in a systematic program of transferring funds to foreign financial institutions. Millions and tens of millions of dollars, in his phrase, moved through channels designed to evade detection. Israel's Channel 14 television reported a more specific figure: $1.5 billion in cryptocurrency routed through an account in Dubai. Of that total, according to the reporting, approximately $328 million was linked specifically to Mojtaba Khamenei. $328 million in cryptocurrency moved through Dubai by a man who held no government office, received no official salary, and had spent his entire adult life presenting himself to the world as a religious scholar indifferent to material wealth. The mathematics of hypocrisy at this scale require a moment to absorb. The Islamic Republic that Mojtaba's father built, that his father's mentor Khomeini built, was explicitly, emphatically, and repeatedly defined against exactly this kind of behavior. Every sermon that thundered against Western materialism, every Friday prayer that condemned the corruption of the Pahlavi era, every revolutionary pamphlet that promised Iranians a government of servants rather than oligarchs, all of it was the backdrop against which Mojtaba Khamenei was quietly, patiently, and very profitably building a personal fortune that would have made the Shah's courtiers blink. He had done it while invisible. He had done it while the Islamic Republic's intelligence apparatus, the apparatus he helped control, was spending its resources monitoring journalists and imprisoning activists and suppressing the political movements that might have exposed what he was doing. He had done it with the patience and the craft of a man who understood that the greatest cover for financial crime is not technical sophistication, but narrative. If the story everyone tells about you is that you are a humble cleric, the story of your offshore portfolio has nowhere to land. The heir to Khomeini's revolution had built exactly the kind of empire that the revolution was designed to destroy, and he had done it in plain sight, hidden behind a reputation for invisibility and a system that punished the people who tried to look too closely. Before we can tell the story of how Mojtaba became the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we need to tell the story of how the throne became empty. And to do that, we need to understand what that throne actually represented, what its occupant had built, what it cost to hold it, and why its sudden vacancy was among the most consequential geopolitical events of the 21st century so far. Ali Khamenei had led the Islamic Republic since June 1989, when he was elected by the Assembly of Experts following Khomeini's death. He was, at the time of his appointment, a relatively junior cleric. He had been elevated to the rank of Ayatollah, specifically to qualify for the position, a move that itself generated controversy in the Hawza. The clerical establishment and many observers, both inside and outside Iran, expected him to be a transitional figure, a caretaker, someone to hold the seat until a more qualified religious scholar could be found. They were wrong. Over the next 37 years, Ali Khamenei proved to be one of the most consequential and durable political figures of the modern era. He survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War that had, to some extent, defined his country's strategic environment. He navigated the reformist challenge of the Khatami presidency in the late 1990s, allowing enough political breathing room to diffuse the worst tensions while ensuring the system's fundamental architecture remained intact. He supervised the acceleration of Iran's nuclear program through the 2000s, calculating correctly that the international community's appetite for military action against Iran was limited by the memory of Iraq. He built the regional proxy network: Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, various armed groups in Syria that gave Iran strategic depth and deniability that no purely conventional military posture could provide. He weathered 4 rounds of increasingly punishing international sanctions that by the end of his tenure had effectively excluded Iran from the global financial system, collapsed the value of its currency, and reduced the living standards of tens of millions of Iranians by measurable and devastating amounts. He also, by 2025, was 85 years old. He had survived prostate cancer. He had undergone heart surgery. He appeared in public less frequently than in previous years, and when he did appear, observers noted a physical frailty that had not been evident before. The question of succession, who would follow him, when, and under what circumstances, had been the defining strategic preoccupation of every government in the Middle East, and of most governments in the world, for at least a decade. The constitutional mechanism for succession is the Assembly of Experts. This 88-member body is composed of senior clerics, elected by the Iranian public to 8-year terms, but required to pass through the ideological vetting of the Guardian Council before they can stand for election. The Guardian Council is itself composed of figures whose appointment, directly or indirectly, traces back to the supreme leader. The result is a structure that is formally democratic. There are elections, there are candidates, there are votes, and substantively circular. The supreme leader's successors are chosen by a body whose composition the supreme leader has, over decades, significantly shaped. For years, Mojtaba's name had circulated as a potential successor, and for years, the reaction, both inside Iran and in the international community, had been deeply uncomfortable. The Middle East Institute, in a widely cited 2024 analysis, warned that appointing the supreme leader's own son would represent a betrayal of the revolution's foundational anti-monarchical principles so fundamental that it could threaten the system's legitimacy with segments of the population that had remained, despite everything, committed to the idea that the Islamic Republic was something different from a dynasty. The New York Times reported that year that sources familiar with the Assembly's deliberations had been told by Ali Khamenei himself that he did not want his son to succeed him. Whether that request was sincere is a question only the men in that room can answer. It is at least equally plausible that it was the kind of ritual humility, the formal disavowal of worldly ambition, that the Islamic Republic's political culture requires of those who most desire what they are disavowing. In a system where the language of self-sacrifice and divine service is the mandatory vocabulary of power, saying, "I don't want this for my son," may be the most effective way to ensure that your son gets it. What ended the ambiguity was the 12-day war. The sequence of events that led to the American and Israeli strikes of late February 2026 is complex, contested, and still not fully documented in the public record. What is established is that on the night of February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign of airstrikes on targets across Iran that included military facilities, command and control infrastructure, nuclear sites, and the compound in northern Tehran where Ali Khamenei resided. The strikes were extraordinarily precise. They were also extraordinarily devastating to the people inside the targeted buildings. Ali Khamenei was killed in the initial strikes. So was his wife, Mansoura Hosseini. So was one of his daughters. So was Mojtaba's own wife, Zahra Haddad Adel, the woman whose father had been one of the Republic's most powerful conservative figures, whose marriage to Mojtaba had been one of the key structural alliances of his political career. In a single night, Mojtaba lost his father, his mother, his sister, and his wife. The financial markets understood the implications before the political system could process them. Oil prices surged to their highest level since 2022, within hours of the announcements. The dollar strengthened sharply against virtually every emerging market currency. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil passes, was immediately identified by analysts as a potential flashpoint. Bond markets in Gulf states began pricing in elevated risk. The global economy, which had spent years slowly recovering from a series of shocks, looked at what had just happened in Tehran and began to worry. Within the Islamic Republic, the political situation was, by any reasonable description, extraordinary. His wife and daughter were dead. There was no designated successor. The country was under active military attack. The Assembly of Experts, the body constitutionally responsible for selecting a new supreme leader, had its offices in Qom damaged by a strike, and in this environment, 3 days after the death of Ali Khamenei, an online session of the assembly was convened. What happened in that session is, at this point, partially but not fully documented. What Iran International reported, based on what it described as accounts from participants and from individuals with knowledge of the proceedings, is this. IRGC commanders made repeated contacts with assembly members in the hours before and during the session. These contacts were described by multiple sources as involving psychological and political pressure of a kind that made the phrase free and fair deliberation inapplicable. Members who raised objections to Mojtaba's candidacy were given, in the words of one account, limited time to speak before the discussion was moved on. A vote was held. And then, before the ballots could be formally counted, American and Israeli aircraft struck the Assembly's office in Qom. The conservative commentator Mohammad Mohajeri publicly argued that the appointment should be delayed, that selecting a new supreme leader under these conditions, with the country at war and the deliberative process visibly compromised, was a mistake that would haunt the Republic. Parliament member Mohsen Zangane confirmed that as late as March 6th, the contest was not resolved, that 2 candidates remained under consideration, and that both were, in his words, reluctant to accept the position. The Expediency Discernment Council, the body that mediates disputes between the Parliament and the Guardian Council, moved to consider whether it should assume interim leadership authority pending a proper succession process. Former Parliament Speaker Ali Larijani, according to multiple reports, was actively working to promote his brother Sadiq as an alternative candidate. None of it was enough. On the 9th of March 2026, the Assembly of Experts announced that Mojtaba Khamenei had been selected as the 3rd supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The international reaction was immediate. President Donald Trump told reporters the appointment was unacceptable and that Mojtaba cannot live in peace without the agreement of the United States. He added, in a statement that broke with virtually every norm of diplomatic language, that he expected a say in the governance of a foreign country. The Israel Defense Forces issued a statement making clear they considered the new supreme leader a legitimate military target. Hezbollah posted a portrait of Mojtaba on Telegram with calligraphic Arabic text hailing him as the leader of the Islamic Revolution. Within 48 hours of the announcement, Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz, sending crude oil above $120 per barrel and triggering the largest single-day move in energy markets in years. The shadow had stepped into the light, and the world was looking at something it had spent 20 years being warned about and still wasn't prepared for. There is a document that has served, for more than 2 decades, as the primary theological argument for why Iran has not built a nuclear weapon. It was issued by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and it declared, in terms the regime cited in every international forum where Iran's nuclear intentions were questioned, that the development, stockpiling, and deployment of nuclear weapons was haram, forbidden under Islamic law. The authenticity and the sincerity of this fatwa has been debated for as long as it has existed. Arms control experts, Iran analysts, and intelligence officials have argued for years about whether it represented genuine theological conviction or sophisticated diplomatic theatre, a move designed to give Iran's Western interlocutors something they could use domestically to justify continued negotiations rather than military action. The Iranian government, for its part, cited it constantly. Iranian diplomats brought it up in every round of nuclear talks. It became a kind of theological insurance policy, a document that said, "We may be enriching uranium to near weapons-grade levels. We may have more centrifuges than any civilian nuclear program arguably requires. We may have developed the expertise and the infrastructure that would allow us to produce a weapon within weeks if we chose to, but we have not chosen to, and here is the religious edict that explains why." Whatever its limitations, the fatwa existed, and while it existed, it was at least a theoretical break on the worst possible outcome. It gave Iranian nuclear decision-making a theological context, one that could be cited, invoked, and potentially held to. Mojtaba Khamenei does not appear to share his father's commitment to this argument. Assessments from the Atlantic Council, from the Council on Foreign Relations, from academic Iran specialists at major universities on both sides of the Atlantic, have characterized Mojtaba as more favorable to developing an Iranian nuclear weapons program than his father, and as explicitly skeptical of the validity of the fatwa. His mentor, Mesbah Yazdi, had no theological objection to offensive weaponry used in what he considered divine service. The ideological framework that Mojtaba absorbed in Qom is one in which the Islamic Republic's survival and expansion takes precedence over almost all other considerations, and in which the acquisition of the ultimate deterrent could plausibly be framed not as aggression, but as the fulfillment of a divine mandate to protect the Islamic order from its enemies. The technical situation makes this more urgent than any ideological assessment. At the moment of Mojtaba's ascension, Iran's nuclear program was, by most credible public estimates, within a matter of weeks of achieving the level of uranium enrichment required to produce a nuclear weapon. The U.S. and Israeli strikes during the 12-day war targeted several nuclear facilities and succeeded in destroying or significantly damaging some of them. This set the program back. It did not eliminate it. The knowledge accumulated over decades of Iranian nuclear development, the expertise of thousands of engineers and physicists, the understanding of the specific technical challenges involved in building a reliable weapon cannot be destroyed by airstrikes. It lives in the minds of the people who did the work. The centrifuges that were destroyed can be rebuilt. The capability, once achieved, can be re-achieved. And then there is the question that no geopolitical framework fully accounts for: psychology. Consider, carefully, what Mojtaba Khamenei experienced in the week of February 28th to March 7th, 2026. His father, a man he had spent his entire adult life serving and positioning himself to succeed, was killed by American and Israeli weapons. His mother was killed in the same strike. His sister was killed. His wife, the woman whose family connection had been one of the foundational alliances of his political career, the woman with whom he had presumably shared a private life behind all the strategy and the ideology, was killed. In a single night, the most intimate circle of his personal life was annihilated by the same military partnership. He has not been seen publicly since the war began. His absence has been interpreted in various ways: as tactical prudence, as a security calculation, as the behavior of a man who knows he is on a targeting list and is not inclined to make himself easy to find. But it is also possible to read his absence as something more elemental. Michael Herzog, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, was asked about the appointment shortly after it was announced. His answer was notable for its directness. "The Iranians are showing defiance," he said, "by choosing the son of Khamenei. It shows continuity, and the guy will probably be vengeful." Vengeful. It is not a word that appears in policy papers. It is not a variable in geopolitical models. It is a psychological observation, the kind that experienced diplomats and intelligence officials make when they look at a situation and recognize that the formal analytical frameworks are missing something important. A man who watched his family killed by the United States and Israel, who has just been elevated to the most powerful position in a country with ballistic missiles and a near-complete nuclear weapons program, who absorbed an ideology that frames conflict with the West as both inevitable and divinely sanctioned. This is not a figure who is likely to be moved by the diplomatic incentives that shaped the calculations of his more cautious predecessor. The Council on Foreign Relations, in its analysis of the transition, suggested that Mojtaba could emerge as a central figure in a militarized Islamic republic, and that his rise might signal a shift from the managed tensions of the late Khamenei era towards something faster, harder, and less interested in the kind of managed confrontation that had, for decades, kept the Islamic Republic functional, if deeply isolated. Not the Islamic Republic of the past, the system of calibrated belligerence and strategic patience, but a version of it that has been both ideologically radicalized and personally traumatized, led by a man whose entire preparation has been for this moment, and whose entire recent experience has been a demonstration of what the West is willing to do to his country and his family. History has a particular kind of irony that it reserves for revolutions. It is the irony of the mirror, the uncanny tendency of revolutionary movements to reproduce, in their own structure, exactly the features of the order they destroyed. The French Revolution overthrew the monarchy in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Within 15 years, one of its generals had crowned himself emperor. The Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the Tsar in the name of the workers. Within 30 years, it had produced a cult of personality so extreme that even the Tsar's court might have found it excessive. The Cuban Revolution overthrew a corrupt and unequal oligarchy in the name of the people. It endured for 60 years under two members of the same family. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was, in significant part, a revolution against hereditary power. This is not a debatable historical interpretation. It is what the revolution said about itself, in its slogans and its manifestos and the sermons of its leader. The Shah was not overthrown merely because he was authoritarian. There are authoritarian governments that survive for generations. But because he was authoritarian in a way that felt fundamentally incompatible with Iranian dignity, because he had confused the nation's wealth with his own inheritance, because he and his family had accumulated personal fortunes from the country's oil revenues, while ordinary Iranians struggled, because he had passed his throne from father to son and was positioning his own son to receive it next. The revolution promised, it explicitly, emphatically, repeatedly promised that the Islamic Republic would be different, that it would not be a monarchy, that it would not pass power through bloodlines, that its leaders would be the most qualified scholars, chosen through a process rooted in divine rather than biological legitimacy. Mojtaba Khamenei is the son of the supreme leader. He is, to be precise, the son of the second supreme leader and the chosen successor in a sequence that has now produced two consecutive leaders with deep family connections to the revolutionary establishment's inner circle. His father-in-law was one of the Republic's most powerful conservative figures. His mentor was one of its most extreme ideologues. His network was built on relationships with the security and intelligence apparatus that has been, for 37 years, the regime's most reliable instrument of control. He accumulated, in secret, a personal fortune of a kind that the revolution was specifically designed to make impossible. Every one of these facts is a mirror held up to the founding promise of the Islamic Republic, and in every one of them, the reflection shows something that Khomeini's revolution said it would never become. He studied under the most hardline interpreter of the revolution's theology, a man who believed democracy was apostasy, and applied those lessons not in a seminary, but in the operational structures of the state. He used his father's proximity to power to quietly extend his own influence through every institution that mattered: intelligence, elections, paramilitary forces, the judiciary's back channels, He built a hidden financial empire of extraordinary scope, while the Islamic Republic's official propaganda continued to define itself against exactly this kind of behavior. He waited with extraordinary patience, while opponents named him as a threat, while analysts debated his ambitions, while protesters begged in the streets for his succession to be stopped, and he outlasted all of them. And he was elected under conditions that multiple participants described as coercive, in an online session held while his country was under active military bombardment, to lead a nation whose founding charter explicitly claims to reject the very principle of dynastic succession that brought him there. The central question now is not about Mojtaba Khamenei's character or even his intentions. It is about whether the system he now leads can survive the contradictions that his ascension has made undeniable. Whether 90 million Iranians, a population that contains some of the most educated, most connected, most politically sophisticated people in the Middle East, a population that has been risking imprisonment, torture, and death for 2 decades in an effort to build a different kind of country, will accept this outcome as legitimate. Whether the young women who took off their headscarves in the streets of Tehran during the 2022 protests will look at the new supreme leader and see someone who represents them in any meaningful sense. Whether the engineers and the artists and the entrepreneurs who have been leaving Iran in accelerating numbers will stop leaving, or whether the pace of departure will increase. And there is the international question, which is no less urgent. The world has spent 20 years managing Iran's nuclear ambitions through a combination of economic pressure and diplomatic engagement that achieved, under the Obama administration, a temporary agreement that was subsequently abandoned and never fully replaced. That entire framework was premised, to some degree, on the existence within the Iranian system of figures who saw the costs of total confrontation and were willing to modulate their country's behavior accordingly. Whether Mojtaba Khamenei is such a figure, whether a man who lost his family to American and Israeli weapons and whose entire ideological formation argues against accommodation with the West is capable of the strategic calculation that negotiation requires, is a question that will be answered in the coming months and years in ways that will matter enormously to every person on the planet. What we know, as of today, is this. The man who was never supposed to lead Iran is now its supreme leader. He controls the nuclear program. He controls the IRGC. He controls the network of regional proxies that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. He controls the financial architecture, both the official one and the hidden one, of a country that, despite everything, remains one of the most significant nations in one of the most important regions on Earth. He has been preparing for this role for 30 years. He has never spoken about it in public. He has never submitted to an interview. He has never been tested by the full exposure of supreme leadership. The ghost in the machine has become the machine itself. The question is not whether the Islamic Republic has changed. It has. The question is whether it, and the region around it, and the world that depends on the region's stability, can survive what that change means. History, which has seen this pattern before, offers a cautious and sobering answer. But history also reminds us that the people inside these systems, the 90 million Iranians who did not choose this, who have been paying the price of these choices for decades, have a way of making their own answers, in their own time, in ways that the men at the top of these systems consistently fail to anticipate. The shadow has stepped into the light, but it is still, in the most important ways, unknown. And the unknown is where this story, the story of Iran, the story of the Middle East, the story of what the 21st century will look like, is still being written.